Hi everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining from all over the world, and welcome to the first of this year's Building to COP webinar series. So the Building to COP Forum, today it's a series of webinars that we're hosting in the lead up to COP. And today we're going to focus on COP 101, a bit of a briefing on what COP is, what it means, and what we can expect as we are working collectively in this sector on the road to COP. So today we're just going to go through quite an exciting agenda. So those of you who will be familiar with the format will remember that we do a round of introductions explaining who this coalition is. We will have a very exciting fire starter presentation from Paul Watkinson, who has previously led negotiations for France and the EU in the climate space. So really excited to hear the insights from the negotiators who are always working very hard at COP. I'm going to take us through a little bit of a COP 101, how it's evolved, what we're expecting to potentially see this year. And then we're going to hear from Will Wild of the Climate Champion team, who's going to talk us through the global stocktake, which I would assume at this stage is a term many of you are familiar with, and what that means in terms of the negotiations and the process this year. And then our colleagues at Global ABC are going to talk us through some of the outcomes from COP29 and also some insights as well. And then hopefully we'll have time to facilitate a bit of a Q&A with all of you as well. So that's the agenda. So if you just go to the next slide. So, who are we, the Building to COP Forum, and what exactly is the intent here? So really what we want to do as a forum is to provide an engagement platform for non-state actors, so the private sector, cities, and countries to support the promotion of the built environment as a critical climate solution, alongside Global ABC, World GBC, and other industry partners who I'll speak to in a few minutes. So by joining these forums, and like I say, this is the first in a series that will bring us up to COP30 in November. What we want to do is share with you the latest industry intelligence from the Building to COP Coalition. Find out, emerging priorities and how the built environment will be represented at COP30 in the blue zone, in the green zone, and by the Building to COP Coalition. Specifically this year to learn about the COP30 presidency action agenda and then the progress from the 30 activation groups, which we'll touch on in a little bit in this call. And also crucially, work with you all to unlock advocacy and collaboration opportunities and working together towards our shared COP30 goals. So if you just go to the next slide, who we are. So we are a coalition who came together ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, which seems like quite a long way again now. And essentially, we're all representing buildings and construction sector and united towards a zero emission, efficient and resilient built environment and cities for everyone, everywhere. So on this call today, 3 representatives from this group will be your facilitators. So I'll just ask my colleagues, Will Wild from the Climate Champion teams and Malaya to just maybe undo your cameras and just wave at everyone so that people are primed to see you when it's your turn to talk us through the agenda items. So we'll be your facilitators for the call today, hopefully able to answer some of the questions you bring up and guide you through the next hour of this COP webinar. So if you just go to the next slide, so we've done those introductions. So I'm going to hand us over to our fire starter, Paul Watkinson. So we're very excited to have Paul with us to join us today because I think throughout the forums that we've hosted over the last couple of years, I don't think we've actually had a negotiator join us. And I think it's really important that those of us who are kind of coming from the non-party side are able to hear some of the insights that Paul is going to be able to share with us. Paul has quite an esteemed career, so he's several decades of high-level experience in tackling climate change and promoting sustainable development. You can see here that he led the French delegation for the UNFCCC, and he helped plan and run COP21 in 2015 and was pivotal in drafting the Paris Agreement. Since then, he's chaired the UNFCCC subsidiary, I always struggle with that word, Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, and was a senior advisor to the COP28 presidency that delivered the first global stocktake. And Paul now works independently and quite focused on how to improve the multilateral climate processes. So we're very happy to have you with us. We very much appreciate your time, Paul. So I will hand over to you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, great. I hope you can hear me clearly. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you to the invitation to take part and give you a few initial ideas and some perspectives on, what the COP is from someone who's been part of the process for many years, but also what it needs to be in the future. You're asking me to give it from a negotiator's perspective, but in fact, I'm no longer a negotiator. I've been in this process for over 25 years. But for the last decade, I would say I've mainly been in a role of helping be part of different presidencies, chairing, taking a role in organizing and running a process, and now giving my comments from the outside. But I'll explain to you a little bit about how I see things. I think the first thing to say is the COP in, strictly speaking, it's an intergovernmental process. It's the conference of the parties that brings together the governments, the national governments that have ratified the UN Climate Convention. And within the Kyoto Protocol, we have the CMP for the meeting of the parties there, and the CMA, the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. That we can call it all of that the COP. We don't need to make a legal distinction between them in our conversation here. Um, a lot of the work there is very, very focused on taking forward the rules that we have set out for implementing, in particular, the convention, and now above all, the Paris Agreement, which has taken up much of our time over the past decade since Paris. In fact, we now have in place almost all of the rules for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And so Berlin COP30 this year is something of a transition COP. We spent a long time putting in place all of these pieces, but they're all there now. We've started to deliver on the different pieces, for example, the transparency system with parties feeding in their biannual transparency reports in the last year. And now we're renewing the nationally determined contributions, the mitigation targets that parties are setting themselves. Many of them also include adaptation and other issues as well. So we're into a stage now where we're very much into the implementation. And again, it makes the process one which is starting to undertake a transition from the way it's traditionally worked. So I'll say a bit about how it traditionally works and then about where I think it's going to kick you off. A lot of the work gets on, a handful of key issues. We talk about climate finance, we talk about adaptation to climate change, we talk about mitigation, we look at how the transparency system works. And a lot of that is about how we develop the guidelines, the different rules that countries need to follow when they're implementing the convention and now the Paris Agreement, how to prepare the reports that they produce, what information needs to be in there. We put all of that into the guidelines over the years, particularly those on the transparency system. We finalized a few years ago for the Paris Agreement. Then we keep track of what happens. How does that get taken forward? Is it working smoothly? In another 2 years, for example, we will come back and review those guidelines and we will have some detailed discussions on do they need updating? How do we improve them? How do we learn from that experience? So increasingly, we're in a sort of cycle of developing rules, applying them, and then reviewing them and updating them to make sure that they're relevant and that they achieve what is required. I think that's a large part of what the COP now has to do. It's keeping things under review, rolling it forward. But I think there's another piece to the work that we have as parties and we need to negotiate, and that's occasionally setting the direction of travel. What is it we need to be achieving? And in the Paris Agreement, we reached agreement on keeping temperatures well under 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit them to 1.5 degrees. In Dubai 2 years ago, in the global stocktake, we had lengthy negotiations on setting some of the shorter term targets, particularly the tripling of renewables, doubling energy efficiency, and transitioning away from fossil fuels and ending deforestation. Setting out that sort of target, setting out also the key issues we need to be addressing on adaptation, sharing that guidance on where we need to be going. We can't do that every year, and I think sometimes we get stuck because we try to go a bit too far down that road. But giving guidance on the direction of travel, that matters to have that globally accepted overview of where we need to be heading, the objectives that we share, the goals that we share. So it's the rules and the applying them. It's where we're going. Um, but then it's about how we work together. And sorry, one final point on the formal negotiating process, because as parties, the official delegation bringing together people from many different ministries. When I ran the French delegation, my own post was attached to the ecology environment ministry, but we brought in colleagues from our foreign ministry, from finance ministry, from our agriculture ministry to deal with all the many different issues that we were addressing. Running that is a complex business. We prepare a lot in advance, not just at the COP, but also using the June session of 2 weeks when parties meet in the subsidiary bodies, prepare a lot of the work for the COP. Um, but preparing all of that side of things, working together, fixing our own positions, working within our negotiating groups. As a French delegate, I spent a lot of time in European Union coordinations. Colleagues from Africa would spend a lot of time working with the African group of negotiators. Other groups spend their time working with their colleagues. But it's also talking to each other. It's that sharing of understanding, building a common sense of where we're heading, which really matters when we're trying to reach agreement. If we all just turn up in a COP and set out our views and we can't find ways forward, we haven't made progress. So we have to prepare that ground. We have to talk to each other a great deal. And the decisions in the process are taken by consensus. That doesn't mean we need unanimity with everyone sticking their hand up to say yes, but it means that no one has to oppose it actively. So reaching agreement takes a lot of effort. It takes guidance. That's where the role of chairs, that's where the role of the presidency becomes very important in helping parties to find common ground, to guide them through a complex process to reach agreement. So the negotiating process is heavy. It's often quite controversial. It often brings out big fights sometimes between parties. But behind the scenes, there is a lot of attempting to find ways forward, using those informal channels, a lot of the bilateral discussions, a lot of the work to try and help us move forward. In terms of the way forward, as I've said several times, I think we're in a time of transition. There are things we can still try to negotiate. As I said, we need to keep our rules under review. I think in 2 years' time, in 2020, 3 years' time, in 2028, we'll have a second global stocktake when we'll look at where we are and maybe set ourselves some further sort of common targets, some common objectives for 2030, but maybe 2035 to go beyond what we did in Dubai. But a lot of what we need now is to strengthen cooperation and collaboration to make things happen. And you can't make things happen just by adopting a decision in a COP. It's the concrete work involving the implementers, those on the ground, and I think your alliances, your groups that you're working with that come together here in this event and I hope very present in the COP in Berlin as you have been in other conferences. More and more, the focus is shifting from the negotiation side to what you're doing, the work taking forward in the action agenda, and particularly as it's being restructured, I think in a very good way by the Brazilian COP30 presidency. We need to turn the process much more into what I've termed an implementation forum, somewhere where we can really share those experiences to accelerate and to facilitate moving forward, overcoming the barriers. And I think that's where we need to bring together the formal pieces of the puzzle. We have a lot of work programs, expert groups, which are delivering a huge amount of information. In a negotiating setting, we don't always use it very well. Whereas I think in the places that you're taking part as the actors of change, that information can be more useful. And I think you're bringing things more and more to the spaces, the action spaces in the COP, which are increasingly the heart of the process. The legal process remains, but I think the effective, pragmatic heart is more and more where you're going. And this year in particular, and I'll finish on this, COP30 is taking place in, let's be very honest, very difficult circumstances. I don't mean that as a comment on the logistics. I know those are challenging to everybody who's worried about their hotels and the rest of it. I'm sure that will work. No, I'm clearly thinking about the geopolitical side, the increasing climate crisis, which is there, the US withdrawal, the active policies of the Trump administration to try and block climate action. And also, we're still waiting for most countries to come forward with their revised nationally determined contributions. But we know that we're still not going to be on a pathway to well below 2 degrees, of course not 1.5 degrees. There remains a big gap in ambition. And I think one of the challenges for this conference is to send a very strong message that we're working on action. We are working to deliver, to overcome the barriers to action. I don't think it's having another message of invite parties to update their NDCs once again. That's not what's needed. It's very much about overcoming the implementation gap. It's very much about really mobilizing the finance which is needed, helping unblock that mobilization of finance, including from multilateral development banks, but also what's needed to lower so the private sector will invest in change, and the domestic finance can also be there. It's bilateral, multilateral, domestic coming together. It's about working to overcome some of the barriers around transition, the just transition questions, which will be on the table in this conference. The big negotiating outcomes this year are not the things which will really make a difference. They matter, having a set of objective indicators for tracking adaptation, finalizing a work program on just transition, deciding how we organize the future global stocktakes. Those matter. But when André de Largo, the COP president, gavels the closing of the COP at whatever time in the final night or morning, I don't think it's those decisions which will make a difference. It's how we're truly strengthening collaboration. Once again, I think the shift has changed. The negotiators still have a role to play, but I think increasingly it's in your hands.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Really, really interesting to hear your insights on the process and all of the work that goes in ahead of COP. And I think a very succinct call to action that it's in our hands. And like you say, we are, a group of stakeholders who are able to facilitate that implementation. So I think that's a strong narrative and call to action that we can take as we kind of mobilize our networks over the next couple of weeks and also after COP to drive that implementation. So thank you very much for your time. So I'm just going to go over now just a kind of a very much back to basics piece, which is a sort of COP 101, which is for those of you who may not, be familiar with the process, how it's come about. You can see here the background, what is COP? Paul has already kind of touched on a lot of this. So I'll whistle through this quite quickly so we can get into some of the meatier content. But I think everyone on this call will be aware that it refers to the Conference of Parties and it's the main decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It takes place every year. And essentially what we're aiming to do at COP is to do those new negotiations and review parties' progress, parties referring to countries against the overall goal of the UNFCCC to limit climate change. I think we're all fairly familiar with the outcome of the 21st session of COP, which was COP21. This led to the Paris Agreement and that mobilized global collective action so that we're working towards a limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's sort of the evolution that we've seen of COP. So who attends? Nearly all of the countries in the world are party to the UNFCCC. Paul has alluded that maybe at the moment, not all countries are participating, and that reflects some of the kind of more challenging political context. In COPs in previous over the last previous years, we've seen approximately 200 world leaders, 30,000 delegates. And nearly 70,000 participants. And then each year, COP is held in a new location, and this year it's going to take place at the City Park in Belém in Brazil. So it's been, sort of dubbed the COP in the Amazon. And the idea is to host it amid the backdrop of the unique biodiversity that is in the Amazon, and a reminder on the need, to protect that. So if you just go to the next slide. So at COP, there's kind of two different zones. Those of you who have been there, who have been working on COP will be familiar with this. But the blue zone is kind of where the official negotiations take place. So that's where you will see the world leaders convene, where the media are based, and importantly, where the negotiators are based. And then for those of us who are part of the Building to COP coalition, it's where we kind of sit as the observers to the negotiation. So that blue zone is a UNFCCC managed site. It hosts those formal negotiations. There's also, a whole host of pavilions that take place, lots of discussions. It's a forum, to bring together different stakeholders to discuss, not only the negotiations, but also the collaborations that are needed. And to Paul's point, specifically, how do we move towards that implementation piece, which I think would be a really important dialogue that takes place in the blue zone this year. And then we also have the green zone, and that's where you will see delegates who are not accredited to participate in the blue zone. So lots of industry are represented there, youth groups, civil society, academia, and the idea is that they are able to have their voices heard through exhibitions, workshops, and talk that promote those inclusive dialogues and awareness about climate action. So as I said earlier, this is a series of calls. So in the next calls, we'll be going into a little bit more detail as to how we see the evolution of events, etc., that are being curated across the blue zone and the green zone. So very much watch this space on that one. If you just go to the next slide. We're not going to go into too much detail on COP30 because we're going to touch on that in future sessions. But just kind of bringing it back to kind of what we're seeing emerge in terms of dates, etc. So it's going to take place from the 10th to the 21st of November. As I say, it's been dubbed the COP in the Amazon. And what we're also learning is that there's going to be lots of events taking place in the preceding weeks in Sao Paulo and Rio. So a lot of people planning perhaps to travel to those three locations in the lead up to COP. So if you just go to the next slide, and we can kind of just look a little bit at the context. So Paul has spoken already about, the action agenda and the importance of kind of demonstrating the actions and implementation activities. And that's a key priority of the Brazilian presidency. So a real focus there will be on, how to turn the global stocktake into action. The presidency have stated that this will be sort of a guiding document in terms of, how decisions are being made, anchoring the outcome for COP30 in those global stocktake. So Will, in a few minutes, is going to talk us through the global stocktake and how it relates to buildings. I'm sure many of you will have heard about, the presidency's call to mobilize a global Mucheiro, which is inclusive collective climate action. And that's something that was very much evident in the response in Brazil to the floods that took place in Rio Grande last year. And how are we mobilizing sort of local communities who are impacted by climate change to address these kind of global challenges. And also, context as well is, again, that point on implementation and also what happens after COP. So the negotiations are one thing, but what are we in particular as non-party actors doing to champion implementation, inclusion, and innovation? So if you just go to the next slide. Those of you who are following the communications from the COP30 presidency will be aware that there's 6 axes and 30 objectives that they have put forward for this presidency. So the 6 axes you can see here on the left-hand side is on transitioning energy, industry, and transport, stewarding forests, ocean, and biodiversity, transforming agriculture and food systems, build resilience for cities, infrastructure, and water, fostering human and social development, and unleashing enablers and accelerators. So that's more of a cross-cutting one, number 6. It's under all of these. And then if you just go to the right-hand side, I haven't listed here all of the 30 objectives that sit under those 6 axes, but I've just pulled out the ones where there's an obvious relevance for the building sector. So that's the tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency, sustainable and resilient constructions and buildings, and then 13, resilient urban development, mobility, and infrastructure. So for each of those 30 objectives, the COP presidency has created what are called activation groups. And those activation groups bring together, international organizations, the high-level champions team, and the COP presidency to focus on what solutions already exist to deliver on those objectives, and focusing on, collating case studies and also what is needed to accelerate those solutions. So those of us in the Building to COP coalition, I think we sit collectively on quite a few of those groups, and our remit in that role is to be championing, how buildings can contribute to each of those objectives. So we'll be able to go into more detail on some of the outcomes of those discussions in future forums. But that's just a little bit of a taster on, the emerging priorities for the COP30 presidency. So if you just go to the next slide. I have talked a little bit about the global stocktake. Paul has also mentioned the global stocktake. And now my colleague Will Wild is going to give us a little bit more granular detail of the elements of the global stocktake and how that speaks to buildings. So I'll hand over to you, Will.
Thank you, Audrey. And both you and Paul have set me up really well for this. And with Paul here, you're able to mark my homework and see how we do. But many of you are here because you're preparing to attend COP, right? And you've already heard a lot about the global stocktake. You're probably very familiar with the words. What I want to give you today is a short primer, a 101 on what the global stocktake is. I also want to explain what it means for the built environment sector. And really what I'm trying to do here is as we work towards what Paul's described as the implementation COP, this pivotal point, I want to give you the language to connect the great work that you're all already doing to this global process. And this, taken together across all of us, is about how do we get the built environment to show up at COP in a way that shows it is absolutely central to implementing the agreed global stocktake outcomes, orienting your work to the political process that the GST, the abbreviation of global stocktake, represents. So next slide, please. Let's start from the start. What is the global stocktake? The global stocktake is the Paris Agreement's way to drive accountability and ambition. It's a cycle, and it's very loosely illustrated on the diagram on the page. And it's a cycle that runs every 5 years, with the first cycle having concluded in 2023. Next slide, please. And firstly, when the global stocktake commences, there begins this massive global inventory on climate action. It's a collective effort. It's not just governments. And during the process, countries, communities, businesses, and civil society all have the opportunity to submit evidence and information, highlighting progress, gaps, ambitions for implementing the Paris Agreement. And there starts a 2-year process of digesting this information and processing it, with experts looking at what's working, what decisions are needed, and what are the pathways that are available for going forwards. And the findings of this review are captured in something called a synthesis report. Next slide. Now, I like to think about the synthesis report as sort of the world's climate report card. It shows what we've achieved, where we're falling short, and where we must accelerate, right? The first synthesis report was published in 2023 ahead of COP28 in Dubai. And the headline was quite stark. We are not on track. Next slide. I've pulled out a few extracts here. The global emissions are not in line with the pathways needed for the Paris temperature goal. There's a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. You might remember that one hitting the headlines quite prominently. And crucially for us in this sector, the report named buildings directly. It calls for ambitious measures to cut emissions from buildings. And it states that it's entirely possible for existing and new buildings to reach net zero by mid-century. Specifically, it highlights the role of low carbon materials, energy efficiency, electrification, and demand side management as key opportunities that need pursuing. Next slide. So after this report is released, countries have the chance to consider it and come together behind a shared response. And this is very much what represented a large part of the negotiations at COP28. And countries came together to agree on the outcomes of the first global stocktake. Now, this was termed the UAE Consensus. This was their collective political response to the synthesis report. And they aligned behind a set of outcome goals within this response, which now shape global action and implementation for the next 3 years. These outcomes are the foundation for the next 3 years, and they provide a degree of political orientation for implementation. So it's really important amongst our community who show up at COP that we understand some of this language, we digest it and understand what these outcomes are that the countries have aligned behind. Next slide. Here at Building to COP, we've dived into these outcomes and we found that actually the buildings and the built environment has a role to play across almost all of them. But there are perhaps 4 that we really feel that the built environment is absolutely central to moving the needle when it comes to delivery. And these are the 4 that you can see on the screen here. And I'm going to take each in turn, give you a little bit of context around it. Next slide, but tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. Buildings are a crucial enabler of renewable energy. They can be sites of generation, integration, and demand flexibility as we electrify our grids. On the ground, this looks like rooftop solar and other on-site renewables across residential, commercial, public buildings, integrating battery storage and demand response mechanisms to balance supply and demand in energy grids, and unlocking the role of electric vehicle charging at home in supporting these energy systems. Next slide. Now, this one is often a mouthful. The goal is doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030, often abbreviated to doubling energy efficiency. And the IEA have really provided some clarity here. The IEA have shown that buildings are the single largest source of potential energy efficiency gains globally, offering 40% of the gains needed to double the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030. Now, in practical terms, this looks like ramping up retrofit rates and mainstreaming efficiency in new construction. On the ground, this looks like upgrading insulation, windows, lighting, heating and cooling systems, replacing outdated appliances with more efficient ones, using smart controls and energy management techniques in buildings, prioritizing electrification, especially in our heating systems, and normalizing high efficiency air conditioning as the demand for cooling rises exponentially. Next slide, please. The third outcome that we want to draw your attention to here is transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner to achieve net zero by 2050. Now here, buildings really matter. They account for 1/3 of energy-related emissions, and the 2 main sources of direct emissions, those that occur on site in a building, are heating and cooling. I keep getting that wrong. Heating and cooking. The report this year by the Energy Transitions Commission offers some useful insights to actually help you think about this. Heating globally represents 80% of direct fossil fuel use in buildings. They've confirmed that it could be almost entirely electrified with heat pumps and district heating networks. Meanwhile, cooking represents about 15% of direct fossil fuel use in buildings. High-income countries should fully electrify cooking by 2040, China by 2050. And in low-income countries, the priority is ending the use of biomass, which has severe health impacts and is highly inefficient in its nature. Done right, this transition in buildings, particularly around cooking, could really demonstrate what it is to have an equitable transition, what this looks like, with these actions delivering not only on climate goals, but on health and bringing economic benefits as well. Next slide. And finally, the outcome of increasing the resilience of infrastructure and human settlements to climate change impacts to ensure basic and continuous essential services for all. Now, a resilient built environment is the foundation of safe, thriving communities. This looks like designing and retrofitting to withstand extreme heat, flooding, storms, wildfires, droughts, protecting critical infrastructure like hospitals, schools, housing, and utilities. It looks like twinned with the nature integration and nature-based solutions such as green roofs, urban trees, and permeable surfaces, and prioritizing upgrades in vulnerable and underserved communities to promote equity whilst closing resilience gaps. Next slide. So as you prepare to attend COP, I really like to encourage you to sit and digest these outcomes. They represent the political language that will orientate global implementation efforts over the next 3 years. I'd love this community to use this language to help frame the action, the great action that you're already delivering, because taken together, this can really sharpen how our sector is presented at COP, showing to national governments that the built environment is the critical platform for implementation. Next slide. And to help, here at Building to COP, we're delighted to share with you this short messaging guide that we'll provide a link for in our mailer after this, and we can put into the chat. This messaging guide is not about telling you what to say. It's about giving you a skeleton of messaging, the hooks, the language, some of the detail that I've just started to touch on here today to help you frame your work through the lens of the global stocktake outcomes, so that the built environment is really clearly seen as a critical implementation platform for the global stocktake. Next slide. Now, to complete the diagram and close this bit out, under the Paris Agreement, the global stocktake outcomes must inform countries' updates to their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, which are due for submission this year. In practice, every country is going to update their NDC. Whether we get them all in time, we will wait and see. There is undoubtedly going to be a gap between the Paris Agreement and the aggregation of the ambitions set out in the NDCs. Next slide. But I want to just touch back on something Audrey started on and really make it clear for you how much COP30 is putting the global stocktake at the center of its focus. I don't know if many of you are reading the letters that are coming directly from COP30, but I've pulled out a few extracts from their 4th letter published last month. Next slide, please. And I just highlighted a few bits that really underscore how central this is to what they're trying to achieve. The first global stocktake stands as our compass for Mission 1.5. The vision of a global mutirao, a collective effort to deliver on the global stocktake, framing the GST as a kind of global NDC, a globally determined contribution. And a real call that the action agenda must drive momentum towards full implementation of the global stocktake. So as we head to COP30, our job is to show that non-state actors are already delivering these outcomes. They're proving that it's not only possible, but increasingly profitable and popular. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Will. So I think really important, I think, to to understand the global stocktake, and thank you for bringing us through that. And also, I think if we can share a link perhaps for the messaging guide and share it after the calls, I think that would be really beneficial, because I think, as well as very clearly articulated, there is a key role for our sector to deliver on the requirements that exist within the GST. So we're kind of coming towards the end of our call, so I'm going to now hand over to our final facilitator of today's session, Malaya Lasley, who is joining us from the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And those of you who go to COP will be very familiar with Malaya, who runs the Buildings Pavilion there. So over to you, Malaya.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Yes, I'm Malia. I support the programs and events at the Global ABC. And yeah, for us, when I say us, Global ABC community and Building to COP community, COP represents the unique opportunity to place the built environment at the center of climate action, to support cities, regions, and countries in addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, of biodiversity loss and pollution, and accelerate climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. So this is really the place to be. And just if we can go to the next slide, please. If I'm going to follow on Will's explanation on the global stocktake, where it's a cycle and it's a cycle, a general cycle that countries follow. Also, COPs for the built environment is a cycle where it's the place to take a step back and reflect and share with the world what has been in a year. So this is why we have the Buildings and Cooling Pavilion that took place last year and hosted more than 40 events, like 3 sessions per day, and we live stream all the sessions for everyone to participate and join and engaged. What did we so reflecting to that launch last year, we launched some products such as the Climate Action Roadmap Toolkit, Global ABC Sufficiency Report. Next slide, please. All the outcomes of the hubs and action groups of the Global ABC, the 10 whole life cycle recommendations for buildings breakthrough, bio-based materials compendium, so on and so forth, to showcase that the built environment needs to be taken into account within climate action. The COP29 was the opportunity as the follow-up action of the Global Forum on Buildings and Climate. Next slide, please. To launch the Intergovernmental Council of Buildings and Climate. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this one, I don't know. Yes. So on the 20th of November last year, we could, when I say we, I always say the built environment as a whole, Global ABC Building to COP, we could launch the ICBC, Intergovernmental Council of Buildings and Climate. That it is an outcome of the Declaration Chaillot, where also that have been coordinated by the Troika, which is Brazil, and this is why in Brazil we could see we will also have a ministerial roundtable taking place to convene all the ICBC members physically. Next slide, please. Also, we a new confirmed direction of the built environment is to highlight subnational action in NDCs. So together with the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, we stressed how we showcased how multi-level governance action is important to achieve mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. It was also the opportunity to launch the subnational cooling pledge supported by more than 25 cities and regions. Also reflecting the built environment effort. Next slide, please. The Buildings Breakthrough Priority Action could start launching their products, showcasing the global framework for actions and in demand creation, or the blueprint for solutions deployment developed led by Solar Impulse Foundation, and as well as interim reports for B1 and B5. Last but not least, in terms of roadmaps, roadmaps are very important to guide countries. Last slide, please. To reflect, to help parties and subnational parties to start their built environment decarbonization. So we launched the toolkit that last year at COP, and we expect to showcase at COP30 the first results on site implemented. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Malaya. So as you can see, there's lots of content that we is driven from the Buildings Pavilion, and we're expecting to see a Buildings Pavilion at COP30 this year as well. So hopefully that will be a really useful space where we can facilitate announcements, further initiatives, and also see the outcomes of the activation groups that many of us are part of that is linked to the COP agenda. So I may just ask Will, Malaya, and Paul to just quickly turn your cameras back on. I think I saw one question come through, which I believe has been answered. So I don't know if people have been able to see the question, so I'll maybe just reiterate. So it's a question from Luca from WBCSD, who's asking regarding, I think to paraphrase, what can we expect from this COP from all the party when we're in a kind of a Trump world, as Luca says, and what does a lower level of success look like, and what is kind of a realistic success? What could go wrong and how? And Paul, you've given quite a thorough message, which hopefully people can review, but I'm just wondering if you want to elaborate a little bit on that further.
I mean, I won't elaborate at length because much of it is points that I'd already tried to highlight in my original comments. It's very much that we have a context which is difficult. Clearly, the US position is withdrawal and pushing back very strongly on climate action is a problem. But as I said, it's also the level of climate action that we're going to see in the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Unfortunately, it's very unlikely to be anywhere near as high as we really need. And it's how we create a response to that. Similarly, the finance which is being mobilized. There was some good news I saw yesterday or the day before from multilateral development banks, which had a particularly, increased their support by, I think it was 14% for climate action in 2024. But we also know there's a lot of pressure on public budgets. That's also, can be some of the bad news which is coming in the context of here. So it's really showing ways forward. And I think that's where it's not the formal decisions which will be the big political bang that we get from this conference. We need them. And corralling those messages coming from leaders, from ministers, bringing them together. That's one of the jobs for the COP presidency, to amplify and to strengthen the commitment which is brought to it. But it's the commitment also from the many actors. That's where many of you on the building side, similarly, those acting on energy or agriculture or other fields, all have something to bring to the table in terms of delivery and action. And it's how that collaboration can be strengthened as we move forward to answer how do we accelerate and close that gap. It's not simply asking for more, it's actually delivering more. And I think that's the real challenge to be put on the table. And I think if the Brazilian presidency, working with the climate champions, working with future COP presidencies, and I hope we'll get clarity on that, can drive that forward with messages on how that's going to be taken forward, not just for the 2 weeks of the COP, but over time as well, because it's not a one-off thing. It's a continual thing we need coming from now on.
Great, thank you. Very helpful. So we have one more question from Eleanor Huggett, and Will has indicated that he would like to answer this question live. So over to you, Will.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Eleanor. Yeah, absolutely right. The Granary of Solutions follows Ambassador Lago's call to flood the world with good news, right? And they're currently mobilizing on how to operationalize this, and more information on that is coming. There are through World GBC, Global ABC, and others as part of the activation groups, there is the opportunity to submit case studies and banks of solutions. And so perhaps if you wanted to follow up directly with myself, Audrey, or Malia, we can support on that directly. But it's going to be twinned with a wider communications campaign as well, that more information will be shared on that soon, and how we can get that message out there across the widest possible audience. I want to sort of hold the flag up at this moment. Next time, on the 16th of October, we have some of the COP30 presidency team joining us, who are going to say a bit more about how the different platforms the presidency is mobilizing are going to come to life within the action agenda.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Will. So I think that's it in terms of questions. So maybe we can wrap up a few minutes early. I want to thank all of our presenters today, particularly want to give a special thank you to Paul. It was really interesting to hear those insights and learn, what life is like as a negotiator. So we really appreciate your time in sharing that with us. I'm going to close the webinar. We will share a follow-up email with the recording, with the information Will has shared in the chat. And also just to say, we'll also be sharing the link for the next forum, which is going to be focused on COP30, what we're expecting to see in a bit more detail there. We'll obviously have a lot more information on the events and how that's emerging, the priorities that we'll be seeing in Sao Paulo in the week before, and also some summits that are taking place with the city summits and local leadership summits in Rio as well. So we'll be able to do an update on all of that. So pencil it in your diaries for the same time on the 16th of October. So with that, we'll close the webinar, and thank you all for your time and your attention.
Thank you all.
Thank you.